Hello, 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 everyone. Welcome to another episode of Sree's daily global COVID-19 show. We're live right now around the world, and we would love for you to share this with your friends and family. My name is Sree Sreenivasan, and it's my honor to convene this daily conversation around all things COVID-19. It's been 206 days and 206 episodes, and today we were planning to only talk about what's next for New York City. But given the big news that started off our morning that I noticed at 5 in the morning when I woke up about the president having testing positive for coronavirus along with the first lady, we had to bring one of our doctor friends to be with us, and we will be talking to Dr. Megan Srinivas, an MD, MPH, who is an infectious diseases physician and a fellow at UNC. She's on Twitter at @YourLocalIDDoc. at @YourLocalIDDoc. And after we talk to her, we'll meet Andrew Berman, the Executive Director of Greenwich Village Society for Historic Preservation, also known as Village Preservation. And we'll learn the lessons of New York's past and what we can learn about how New York bounces back from this crisis, from the crises in the past. I'm adding too many crises there. And we'll be joined by Jonathan Boorstein, who's a writer in The Village, who has watched 206 episodes of this show, and he will be joining us to ask Andrew some questions and also to share his thoughts on all the news and everything that's going on. Hello, everyone. I'm Sree. Thank you so much for being here. I'm the Marshall Loeb Visiting Professor of Digital Innovation at Stony Brook School of Journalism and the co-founder of Digimentors, a social, digital, and virtual events consulting business. Our motto: let us help you plan your virtual events. We've done events for 50 people and 100,000 people. We've done events for doctors and surgeons, and we've put on talk shows. We'd love to talk to you, so please email me, sree@sree.net. SREE@SREE.net is my email. We'd love to talk and to see if we can work together. If you haven't seen the show before, in our first 200 episodes, we've had more than 1 million viewers and 148 million social impressions, 357 guests, 208 of them women, from 67 cities and 19 countries. I believe one of our guests today is from a place we've not had a guest speaker before. We've even had the chief scientist of the World Health Organization. All our archives are on youtube.com/Sreenet, and we're in partnership with Scroll Global and Scroll.in. Please check them out. We're able to do this because of our sponsors. We're always grateful to, and we'll thank them later in the show. And we're grateful to our awesome producers, Rose Horowitz at Rose Horowitz 31 and Vandana Menon, Vandana_Menon. Please follow them. We're live right now on Facebook, on Twitter, on YouTube, and on LinkedIn. Please share so that your friends can watch now or later. We know you have questions about what it means now that the president and the first lady have been pronounced to have COVID-19 and the coronavirus, and also what it means that he's now spending several days at the Walter Reed Hospital. So we are going to learn the answers to all of that and more in this episode. And we're now going to bring on our Dr. Megan Srinivas, MD, MPH, at @YourLocalIDDoc. So please say hello to Megan Srinivas. Hello, Doc.
Hi there, Sree. It's great to be on the show with you tonight.
Thank you. We've never met before, and we're not related in case anyone asks, but thank you so much for being here. My first question to everyone is, how are you? Where are you? And how are you and your family doing through this crisis?
So I'm based in Iowa, even though I work full-time at the University of North Carolina, but a lot of my research is focused on rural health equities. So being back home in Iowa, where I was raised, makes perfect sense for what I do. And my family and I were doing well. I did unfortunately have an uncle who passed away from COVID about a month and a half ago. So it has touched close to home. But otherwise, my parents, my brother, we're all staying at home, staying safe, and doing everything we can to try to stop the transmission on our ends.
I'm sorry to hear about your uncle. Our deepest sympathies and condolences. What did you learn about his condition and how it all went down with him that's relevant for others who are watching tonight?
Well, he was in that higher age category. He was 70 years old, but he was otherwise healthy. He had very well-controlled diabetes. So it really shows that it can unfortunately infect anybody. Even those who are staying at home and staying safe, his only exposure had been in a grocery store, even though he masked up. So it's really about the overall day-to-day transmission that's happening in the community. So there's risk all around us. All we can do is try to take as much precaution and try to keep those around us safe and care for their health by wearing masks around them as well.
So can you tell us where you were this morning when you heard the news?
So I actually heard the news really late last night. I was up working on actually a project for one of our COVID-19 vaccine trials. And so I was up working with some colleagues when we all saw the headline pass, and we were, of course, worried because we don't want anybody to have to pass away from this. And we send our condolences to the White House and anybody else who might be infected, and the family of the president.
And what did you sense or know immediately as an infectious diseases doctor that someone who hasn't been paying attention wouldn't know?
It made me very concerned about the fact that both President Trump and his wife, the First Lady, were probably infectious during the time that they were at the debate. And so I was concerned about the people who were at the debate as well, because that was in a confined, closed space for an extended period of time. And anybody who might have come in contact with him through his rallies, through any other type of media opportunities he's been having and all of the work he's been doing, that is a lot of potential infected people that need to be contact traced, need to be tested, need to go into quarantine to ensure that they don't infect somebody else unintentionally themselves.
And what is the fact that they both got it tell you? The fact that, do you see lots of couples getting it together like that?
We do. We definitely do. The people in your own household are the ones that you have the most close contact with, and for longer extended periods of time. And especially being a romantic couple, if they had kissed or done anything that would directly enable them to swap virus through a mucosal surface, that is a very high risk relationship for having both people get infected if one is.
And what does this mean that they were tested and they immediately got that result? Does that mean they were sick from yesterday or sick from, as you said, even 3-4 days before? And talk about being symptomatic and asymptomatic. There are some of these terms that some of us haven't thought about in a while that now we're again paying attention to.
Of course. So the exposure that got them sick had to have happened at least a couple of days prior to that test. The soonest we see somebody be able to test positive on the test that we have available right now is really 48 hours after exposure. That is the soonest. So his and the First Lady's exposure must have happened at least 48 hours prior. However, the best sensitivity, meaning the most likely scenario when we find somebody is able to test positive, is usually about 5 days after the exposure and after they were infected. So it could have been that he was exposed as much as 5, 7, or even up to 14 days prior, but 5 tends to be the average. The issue with your contagiousness when it comes to this virus is that it starts before you even have symptoms. So the 2 days prior to any symptoms, and I'm talking about even mild symptoms, if they felt slightly lethargic, if you had a little bit of a stuffy nose, those all are symptoms, even if they weren't very noticeable and could have been attributed to something else. So 48 hours prior to even the slightest symptom starting is when we consider your infectious period to have started. So if he started having symptoms Friday morning, as some sources are saying, some people are saying he was feeling tired even sooner than that, then that does make me concerned that he might have been infectious all this week.
And we're seeing a photo of him arriving at Walter Reed. What does it mean that he walked across the lawn, was able to walk onto the helicopter by himself, and then, as you can see, exit the helicopter by his own power?
That's more reassuring compared to when I first heard that he was going to Walter Reed. It made me concerned that he had deteriorated far more quickly. But the fact that he was able to walk by himself means he has enough strength to be able to do that, which is a good sign. But on top of that, that exertion he was able to tolerate without running out of breath. And breathlessness and shortness of breath is one of the big things that we get very concerned about in patients who are hospitalized or are going to be hospitalized. So to me, those were reassuring seeing that, but it doesn't necessarily mean he's out of the woods, especially because this is the beginning of his course of illness.
We understand that there's a very elaborate medical, department and operating theater, all of that inside the White House.
Mm-hmm.
Why are they taking him? It doesn't look like an emergency, into a hospital setting. A lot of us worry about going to hospitals unnecessarily. So what is the risk, and why announce in advance that there's going to be a few days? Why not just say we're going to check him out there? I'm trying to keep the politics out of this and try to operate as if this is a White House that tells the truth. So if you can tell us about that.
So when it comes to saying it's just going to be a few days in the hospital, that I find a little bit hard to predict. The hospital's not a hotel. When you go there, it's because of you're not feeling well, and there is a situation where you need to be monitored for your health. And being able to predict where that's going to go is very hard to do, especially with this disease. The few days was likely to reassure the public, because when the leader of a nation is in a high-risk scenario with a potential for death, it does cause a lot of panic. So I'm sure that they wanted to reassure the public that he was not deteriorating rapidly right now, but that they were moving him to the hospital with the intention that he would hopefully get better in a few days. But in all honesty, we can't predict that right now. It all depends on how he does over the next few days. As far as needing to move him out of the White House, that is a great question. They do have an elaborate setup there, but especially given the fact that there are so many medications and procedures that are still not authorized by the FDA, but we have to have special permissions within hospitals to be able to give them, such as remdesivir. These are still experimental, but we've seen good data to support it. It would put him in a position where if for some reason he needed a treatment like that, it would be easier for him to get, because he'd have to be monitored under the certain physicians that have the authorization to be able to give these experimental medications.
Thank you. This is really, really helpful. And I know our audience has questions, so we'll go to those questions. Folks, please type in the comments. Tell us your questions for Dr. Srinivas. Tell us a little bit about your own work, and your handle's so unusual. Your local ID doc. And so ID is a term that means infectious diseases doctor. But what about this angle of local? And normally when you hear your local, like your local general practitioner, your local internist, but your local infectious disease doctor.
So I grew up in a small town in Iowa, and unfortunately, one of the issues with a lot of rural health systems is that it doesn't get enough focus, that it's not a sexy topic. So even as we're finding that health systems in rural areas of the country are unfortunately being underfunded and often even shutting down, and it's restricting the amount of care we have for these populations, it's not getting that attention, that focus. That combined with the fact that when it's something scary like this, when we're dealing with a pandemic and people are unsure of where to go to for appropriate news that they can trust, being somebody who's local, who has patience in that town, who has treated people there, who has the trust, because I've been lucky enough to be given that trust in my role as a physician. I wanted to emphasize that I wasn't doing this because of a partisan nature, that the reason that I'm tweeting studies, the reason that I'm sharing my knowledge is trying to get the information out to the people who could use it to keep themselves safe and their community safe. And that is exactly what I wanted to emphasize with my handle, and hence the nomenclature.
I like that a lot. And you are able to work. Is this because of the pandemic that you're working in Iowa and North Carolina, or you were already doing that? Were you remote before it was fashionable and mandatory?
So it's been a little bit more remote than what I am used to, but it is definitely something that I had already started to do beforehand. So I'm in a situation where I do fly back to North Carolina to be on service when I do the inpatient service, but I also provide some telehealth services where I can do from anywhere to some of the prison system in North Carolina. And on top of that, most of my research is global health research or rural health research. And so being based in Iowa, where some of my research is focused, is very helpful for my day-to-day, but then also I can fly out for my global health research from anywhere. So it's been a lot of travel, but I've been able to be based in my home state, which is very meaningful to me, but still have the wonderful structure of University of North Carolina and the resources open to me, and being able to still provide service to the patients there and here has been great.
And what town are you in?
Fort Dodge, Iowa.
Okay, I've never heard of it.
It's a town I grew up in, that small town. It's about an hour and a half north of Des Moines.
All right. Let's see. Doug Levy is watching from California. Hi, Doug. Thanks for being here. Doug has a terrific newsletter all about coronavirus. He's at SF Doug on Twitter. And Ellen says this should be interesting. And of course, it has already been. Pradnya says hello from Silver Spring, Maryland. Linda says good evening from Long Island. Have poor Wi-Fi tonight, so she may not be able to stick around for long. Jonathan's with us from the East Village. He's watched 206 episodes, and we'll be talking about the Village in a few minutes. And Pradnya says, how many people have been exposed during the debate and subsequent campaign events?
It's a good question. Typically, when you think about exposures, you're thinking about close contacts, so we're thinking short distances that droplets can spread. So most of the time when you're hearing exposure, you're hearing those that have come within 6 feet. However, in the setting of the debate, I would say anybody who is in the audience would be in a proximate contact situation, which is that third category that we contact trace for. And it means that you are in an enclosed space where air circulation could essentially help to unfortunately make those droplets travel to a further distance and potentially expose people who are more than 6 feet away from you. Combine that with the fact that there was a lot of voices raised, a lot of yelling, a lot of very forceful talking that would propel your droplets potentially even further. So how many people in the audience? I don't know, but that does increase the risk for a lot of people who are there. And the rallies, the other events that are on the president's schedule, I can't even come to surmise how many that might be. But I do know that we have great contact tracers in our nation. Hopefully they will be getting to the bottom of that question for us soon.
And one of the things that's so upsetting is that reporters who were on the flight on Air Force One were not told. They should have been contacted immediately. They weren't even told about Hope Hicks, let alone about the president and all of that. And that's what you're seeing. And this tweet, I think, captures the ridiculousness of this. Charlie says, I've hugged one human in the last 6 months. And here is Senator Mike Lee of Utah, who has now been confirmed to be that he's positive, coronavirus, COVID-19 positive. Look at all these people. What is your reaction when you see this? This is at the announcement of Amy Coney Barrett as the nominee for the Supreme Court.
It makes me really worried. The spread is astronomical in a situation like this if just even one person is infected. And if people have been having these type of interactions with so many different bubbles of people, then it's likely that it's just going to keep on spreading and spreading and spreading, and thousands of people could be impacted. It makes me concerned about the messaging that we are sending out to the public, that you don't need to wear a mask. And the misunderstanding that just because you're outdoors, you're magically protected, which is completely untrue when it comes to the spread of this virus.
Oh, can you talk about that, please? Because the president lied multiple times as an excuse. He said it was all outdoors. He's had multiple indoor rallies, but you're saying even an outdoor rally or an outdoor situation, does it buy you at least something?
It does buy you a little bit more protection. So if you're going to do something, I would say that involves other people, I would say definitely do it outdoors. But if it's a crowded scenario, if people aren't wearing masks and people aren't social distance, that additional protection from being outdoors is negligible, especially if you're also touching people beyond just not being properly social distanced. So the only times that, unless I'm seeing patients, of course, the only times that I've interacted with people that I've, even if it's been outdoors, I make sure I'm still wearing my mask, and that with both of our masks on, we're at least 6 feet apart.
Thank you. Pradnya says, how much crossover is there between your rural health work and your global health work? Would love to hear more.
There's actually quite a bit of crossover. And that's one of the things that's so fascinating to me, is that there is so much sexiness to global health work, but a lot of those same solutions that are happening in the global health world are so applicable to our rural health realms and our rural health obstacles. So it really kind of goes hand in hand, which is why I am in both worlds, is we can really use the research in one area to help people in a completely different area of the world. And that is what is so beautiful to see, how we can combine our minds and solve problems together.
I love hearing that. And I understand that there are many situations in America where healthcare and health situations are as bad as in some developing countries. We had the great writer Sapphire on the show. She wrote the novel Push that became the Oscar-winning movie Precious. And she said, all you doctors and others keep saying, wash your hands. There are parts of Native American reservations where there's no running water. So what the heck are you talking about? It was kind of a jolt to hear that at the beginning of the pandemic. To hear that from Ms. Sapphire was really powerful. So what I'm going to do now is to bring on our next guest, who was scheduled to be here for the full hour. He has kindly given up some of his time to talk about this very important issue, and then have you both here for a few more minutes, and then we'll give you back your Friday night. So thank you again for being here. Everyone, we are going to meet our friend Andrew Berman. He's the executive director of the Greenwich Village Society for Historic Preservation. We're going to talk all about New York, but I'm going to have him chat for a minute with Dr. Megan. But before that, I want to remind you that we have our Saturday morning show so that our producers can get their Saturday nights back. Tomorrow morning, meet Manisha Koirala, one of the biggest Bollywood stars and author of Healed, How Cancer Gave Me a New Life. She joined us on the show 177 days ago, and she's back for a fantastic conversation, but it's at 9 a.m. Eastern, so please join us for that. And then on Sunday morning, we will be with our New York Times read-along, where we read the New York Times out loud like crazy people. It's the start of our 5th year, and the former New York Times editorial page editor, Andrew Rosenthal, will be with us. Of the 2 people you see on the screen, only one was born in New Delhi, and it wasn't me. It was, in fact, Andy, when his dad, the great Abe Rosenthal, was Delhi correspondent for the New York Times. So you'll meet him at 8:30 a.m. on Sunday. So 9 a.m. Saturday, Manisha Koirala, and 8:30 a.m. will be Andrew Rosenthal. And then on Sunday night, Positivity with Ruth Rathblott. We'll talk about how she stays positive even as she works with underserved youth in New York City and does so much to help kids get into college. All right, here we go. We're going to meet Andrew Berman. Thank you so much, Andrew, for being here with us today.
Hi, thanks for having me. It's a fascinating conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you for letting me eat into some of your time, Andrew.
Oh, my pleasure.
I just want to say this is an unusual moment. 2 Srinivasans here and Andrew Berman. So Andrew is now the minority in this situation, white male minority status he has been thrust into here. But Andrew, thank you very much. Tell me what are your reactions to what you've heard so far? And then if you have a question for the doc, you're welcome to ask.
Yeah, I mean, I think like every American, obviously this was shocking news. Honestly, I feel a mixture of emotions in connection to it. More than anything, I just hope it really highlights to people how serious this is and how seriously we need to take it. It seems like too few people are taking it as seriously as they need to. And if nothing else good comes out of this, hopefully it'll push more people in that direction. And the question that I have for the doctor, which, to the degree to which you can answer this, because I know, nobody has all the answers, looking at what's been going on in the country over the last 6 months, certain parts of the country, the numbers go up, they go down, they stay the same. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are. Is that purely a function of how well people are taking precautions, or are there other things going on? And I'll just sort of frame this by saying here in New York City, though clearly there's a lot of people taking a lot of precautions, I wish I could say that I saw everybody being as cautious as they should be. They're not. And yet the numbers until very recently have been very, very low, very flat for a long time. So I'm wondering if you think there's other factors involved as well.
So there are probably likely other factors involved from a genetic standpoint with the virus, but the biggest thing really is honestly the mitigation strategies that we're doing. So whether it's masking up, we've seen just from the data alone that even if we can get 70 to 80% of the people to mask up consistently, that alone is enough to really drive down the transmission and essentially give an almost faux herd immunity status because there's nowhere for the droplets to spread. So between that, between social distancing, between reducing the ability to intermingle in businesses, those are all strategies that have been employed very effectively in some parts of the country. But then there are other parts of the country, like my own state of Iowa, where we don't have a mask mandate at all, never have had one. We never shut down completely. We had a mandate by our state leaders that requires schools to go back to in-person learning. All of those things together over the last 4 to 5 weeks, they all happened around Labor Day. Those actions of people intermingling at a higher rate, combined with the Labor Day crowds, now we're seeing those spikes about 4 weeks later, as we expected to see in our hospitalization rates and our new case rates. And unfortunately, what happens in one part of the country doesn't stay there.
Sure.
As much as we recognize these boundaries of Iowa versus Nebraska versus whatever other neighboring states there are, people are driving across these borders. They're carrying the virus with them, and the virus is happy to find new populations to transmit to. So while New York might have cracked down initially and been very strict and been able to get it under control, the loosening of some of these restrictions, as well as the fact that people are likely coming from other hotspots and bringing infection in with them, is going to be able to increase the transmission yet again.
Sure, of course. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I wish, I understand the feeling that people have a hardship created by these cautions and precautions, but I wish they would just recognize that the hardships created by not following the precautions are so important.
You're exactly right. It's this false dichotomy of economy versus health,
Right.
which is not true at all. If people are healthy, we can engage with the economy. We put our money in the economy, and workers are able to be a part of that economy. If people aren't, then it's only going to restrict our growth and actually create, unfortunately, the remnants of what we're seeing right now.
Yeah, absolutely great. Sadly, it seems emblematic of so many false dichotomies that are part of the sort of civic conversation these days here in America. But that's another conversation.
Yeah, and you on the ground in New York, what have you seen as far as change in behavior between now and 3 months ago or 5 months ago?
I think certainly when we were at the height of things in April, first of all, the city was a ghost town, which was, shocking to see. People were, for the most part, incredibly cautious. Outside, for the most part, as little as possible. Always masked up, wearing gloves, keeping their distance. I have to say, over the last 5 or 6 months, people have gotten a lot looser. We have outdoor dining, which, I understand the necessity of it. It's very clear to me, though, when you're walking past these outdoor diners who are, not wearing masks because you can't really eat and wear a mask, that it's not all people from the same household. Oftentimes it's friends. And so, they're sitting there in close proximity eating a meal. And if, God forbid, one of them has it, they're going to pass it along to the other one. And I live in a part of town where there's a lot of restaurants, a lot of outdoor dining. And so, it concerns me. I've been pleasantly surprised that we haven't seen the rates go up here in New York City, although they are starting to tick up. Apparently, mostly in certain specific areas where it seems like there may have been some super spreader events. But personally, I think everybody needs to treat themselves and everybody else as if they potentially have it and take the appropriate precautions.
I could not agree with you more.
Andrew's giving us great medical advice. I like that. Before we let you go, Doc, any advice for us as you're in a completely different part of the country, rural Iowa, here we are in New York City. What should we be looking for? Because one of the things we understand is that the winter months means it can come back, right? The idea was that the summer months, we didn't see all that, but we had expected the summer months to affect the virus in a different way than it actually did. Are you worried about the winter months?
I'm very worried about the winter months. There's still many parts of this country that are in their first wave and upticking. And then when the winter months comes around, the humidity or the lack thereof really, and the temperature changes and the gathering in person are all factors that could increase the transmission and the presence of COVID, combined with other co-infections that can reduce your immune system, even if it's just the common cold or the flu. those make you more susceptible to things like COVID. And for those that have already had it and unfortunately do have damage to their lungs or other organs, it once again creates that base, that foundation that makes them once again more susceptible to COVID. So I do worry what's going to happen, especially as people have COVID fatigue and start to reduce the amount of precautions that they are taking.
And we've certainly seen that fatigue. Cherry is asking, he's from Kerala, India. Have you been to Kerala, either of you? No?
I haven't had a chance to go to Kerala. It's on my list.
Okay. So he's asking, how are you all? So that's one of the things we're dealing with. As soon as the Trump news happened, people all over the world started asking about what's happening in New York and in America. So what is your message, Dr. Srinivas, about the next few days with the president? What are we looking for? Presuming perhaps incorrectly that we will get accurate information. Maybe we will because it's Walter Reed. What should we be looking for? And then we'll let you go.
The big thing is just to see how he progresses symptomatically. If he starts to improve, that's a good sign. And if that improvement is consistent over the next 10 days, and he then remains afebrile, that's a really good sign that he will come out of this with very little damage. If unfortunately his symptoms deteriorate, then it's just going to be a day-by-day scenario where the doctors are going to have to make hard decisions as to how to treat him, which experimental drugs to use if needed, and at what point to start those.
And the fact that he was able to walk and everything doesn't tell us either way whether he's going to get worse or better immediately based on today. So people who've pronounced this mild are not using medical terms, correct?
I would agree completely. They're not. He might have technically mild symptoms now, although I can't tell that just from watching him walk. But even if he is mild today, it doesn't mean that he'll be mild tomorrow or even 8 hours from now. This is the point in the infection where we just have to see what the virus has in store.
And we know that his age and his obesity are all factors in this. You should know that Robert Anthony says this is the calmest, most recent, and least hyped up explanation of COVID-19 I've heard all day. Thank you, Dr. Srinivas. That's beautiful. And Ashok says, welcome to Kerala. So that's there you've got an invitation already. Thank you very much. I hope you'll come back and talk to us more. Please follow Dr. Srinivas. You can find her at your local ID doc on Twitter. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Stay safe, everybody.
Bye-bye. That was a fabulous conversation. And now we're going to try and move on to another fabulous conversation with Andrew Berman talking about New York City. The reason we wanted Andrew to come on is that he is the executive director of the Greenwich Village Society for Historic Preservation, and so knows the history of the village and of New York better than most. But also, we wanted to learn about what New York has gone through in the past, 9/11 and earlier, that can teach us about our ability to bounce back. There's so much worry about New York. And in one way, the president and his allies make it sound like New York's on fire and a zombie hellscape. And to some people, that is just what they expect of New York. But those of us who live here, know that there are still problems. There are things that we saw today, that Rick Moranis, the actor, got kind of sucker punched on the streets of New York on video by some guy who was walking by. Things like that just add to the kind of the mythology of New York and its safety issues and everything. So let's have Andrew kind of introduce us to himself and the organization which calls itself Village Preservation as for short. And you can find the organization. We'll show you the website and all that and much more. And then our friend Jonathan Boorstein will also be joining us. So go ahead, Andrew. And again, thank you for your patience and thank you for taking over some of that questioning there.
Sure, and thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure. As you said, I'm the executive director of what's now called Village Preservation. We're a nonprofit founded in 1980, and our mission is to celebrate and protect the special architectural and cultural heritage of Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo, which are three very historic neighborhoods in Lower Manhattan. I myself am a lifelong New Yorker. I grew up in the Bronx. I've lived here my entire 51 years. I'll say I pride myself on not making proclamations about things that I don't know the answers to. So I can't predict the future for New York, but I'll say it's not the first crisis or even the first pandemic the city's been through. It's not even the first pandemic it's been through in my lifetime. I lived through the AIDS epidemic in New York, which had a devastating impact. And much of the city's history has been shaped by crises, epidemics, things of that nature. And that's, for better or worse, kind of in the nature of cities. I had a very good friend of mine who used to live here, who moved to New Orleans just before Katrina. And she fled when Katrina happened, as a lot of people did. And she expressed to me at the time that she was very concerned that it was going to be the death of the city. And I said, I hope that's not the case. And, if you look at San Francisco after the earthquake, Chicago after the fire, that's not typically the course that cities take. And I don't think it's going to be for New York either, although without a doubt, we're taking a really heavy hit here. And a lot of people are even more affected than others. And there's going to be a lot of recovery to do. But I think the death of New York City is greatly exaggerated.
Thank you. I'm glad to hear that. Tell us some of the things we can find on your website. And did you recently redo the website?
Yeah, this is a new website. We sort of relaunched it. We used to be at gbshp.org, which was the initials of the organization's sort of full formal name. We've moved to the name Village Preservation, and now we've moved to this website, villagepreservation.org. And there's literally thousands of pages of wonderful things in there. Everything from, you're showing now our historic image archive, which has about 2,200 images, not just of the neighborhoods that we represent, but the 5 boroughs of New York City, concentrated on our neighborhoods, but a lot throughout the city. Information about the advocacy campaigns that we're working on, trying to protect the history, architecture of our neighborhood, developments that we're pushing back against that we think are bad or harmful, and a ton of resources about the history of our neighborhoods with this particular focus on things like civil rights and social justice history. We have this wonderful civil rights and social justice map that we've created because one of the great things about our neighborhoods is the huge role that they played in so many civil rights movements, the LGBT civil rights movement, African-American civil rights movement, the women's movement and the women's suffrage movement. We, for the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment this past August, we released a 19th Amendment story map where we had about 24 sites of special significance to the history of women winning the vote. So there's just a lot of great ways you can explore and dissect the history of our neighborhoods through our website, as well as getting involved in our preservation efforts.
And you can find that all at villagepreservation.org. In preparation for this, I went and saw, I guess, the old website. So I'm blown away by how smart and well designed this is. So congrats to you and your team.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, it took 2 or 3 years, so that's good to hear.
So let's, if we can do a little bit of geolocation for people who aren't from New York. They know a little bit about Manhattan, and they've heard of Greenwich Village. There's Harlem, and you were born in the Bronx all the way north, so as far away as you can and still be in New York City, as far north as you can be and still be in New York. And so talk to us about what is the Village and why is it important and what's the history of it? And then we'll click on some of these really cool images you have here.
Sure. Yeah, so Greenwich Village and the East Village in NoHo are in Lower Manhattan, and Manhattan and New York's history started in the very tip of Manhattan. That's sort of where, there's the sort of from the old Broadway play, they say the Bronx is up and the Battery's down. The Battery, southern tip of Manhattan, and that's kind of where the city started and grew north from there, slowly at first. But when it did, certainly coming into the early 19th century, there actually, by an interesting coincidence, were a series of epidemics in Lower Manhattan, in that lower tip of Manhattan, which at the time was New York City. And that sent a lot of people up to the north to what was then the village of Greenwich, which was still farmland and houses and relatively rural. And that's how neighborhoods like Greenwich Village transformed into the urban neighborhoods that they are today, starting in the early 19th century, basically as a refuge from the epidemics that were taking place in what was the sort of concentrated heart of New York City. Interestingly, though, I have to mention that long before these neighborhoods became the urban neighborhoods that they are today, one of the interesting but often overlooked aspects of their history is the first non-Native American settlers of these neighborhoods were African Americans. They were actually freed blacks in the New Amsterdam colony who won their freedom and were given land grants to farm the land north of what was New Amsterdam. The Dutch had a little bit of a sort of self-interest in doing this. They wanted to create a buffer between them and the Native Americans to the north, with whom there were sometimes tensions or conflict. But it's really a wonderful part of our neighborhood's history that it has this early foundation that has to do with the struggle for freedom. It's always been a part of what these neighborhoods are.
I'm looking right now at North America's first free black settlement was right there. I did not know that. So that's around, I guess, NoHo and right around there, Astor Place,
yep.
all of that. I also didn't realize this sort of looks gerrymandered. If you look at the map, you can see it's not like a block or, it's like it's got these little nooks and crannies. Can you talk about that? How did all that happen?
Right. Well, it happened over a period of about 15 or 20 years, about 24 different land grants that were given to these former slaves, Africans and of African descent. And so that's why it has this kind of strange shape. But it was the very first free black settlement in North America. So it has, incredibly important history to it. There are records from the Dutch era, so we know the names, or at least the first names, of every one of these people, and we have some stories about them. Some of them were women, single women. In fact, the first person to get a land grant for what is now Washington Square was a woman, a widow. So it's really an incredible story of struggle. The status of and the situation for African Americans in New York changed substantially for the worse after the English took over. The Dutch were, their system of slavery and indentured servitude was less harsh than it was under the British. And by the 1700s, all of those African landowners were gone from that area. But interestingly, in the 1800s, once it became this urban neighborhood of Greenwich Village, it actually again became the center of African-American life in New York. And a section of Greenwich Village was known as Little Africa, and it was the largest African-American settlement in New York City. And it kind of stayed the heart of African-American life in New York until just about the beginning of the 20th century.
Wow, this is such a great historical, history lesson. You're listening to a conversation with Andrew Berman, who is the executive director of Village Preservation, an organization dedicated to Greenwich Village in New York. And we'll talk to him in a minute about what we can learn from our past crises to help us with our current crisis. And I'm going to now ask our friend Jonathan Boorstein to join us and to ask some questions. He's a much tougher interviewer, so watch out. And
hello.
Let's see if we can get him on here. Hi, Jonathan. How are you doing? You've watched 206 episodes. Even though I've been on every episode, I've not seen 206 of these because I've tuned out large sections of them. But you are such a great and dedicated viewer. Thank you so much, and thank you for. Sorry.
I want a gold star for attendance.
Yes, you will get that for sure. So thank you for bringing Andrew here with three guys with the same hairstyles today. And we want you to talk to him a little bit. And you both know the village so well. You always report in, watching from the East Village. And we'd also like to understand that East Village versus the village and all of that. So go ahead, and I'll step out for a minute.
Oh, that's actually a great segue. But first, I'm going to ask a different question. because our audience is worldwide. Many people have not heard of the concept of historic preservation. What is it? How does it benefit people?
Sure. Well, it's a great question. So historic preservation, broadly speaking, is preservation of the built environment and of its history. It can take a variety of forms, but certainly in New York City, one of the main forms it takes is landmark designation. The city of New York can landmark either buildings or other kinds of sites or districts. And through that, the sites which are so designated then are subject to the regulation of a government body called the Landmarks Preservation Commission. And those buildings cannot be changed substantially or torn down unless they get permission from the commission, who agrees that it's appropriate to the historic significance of the area. And so much of Greenwich Village, which is, of course, one of the oldest and most historic parts of New York, is landmarked. A chunk of the East Village, which we also represent, where Jonathan lives, is also, but a smaller piece, and NoHo as well, which is sort of the neighborhood in between them. And the way in which, it's interesting, landmarking really is at its very core about the public interest. Because the way in which it regulates buildings is it doesn't change what you can or can't do on the inside. It doesn't change who can or can't live there. And it doesn't even affect changes that you make to the buildings that the public can't see. What it's about is what the public can see and can appreciate. And it helps to ensure that the historic nature of these neighborhoods in terms of what the public gets to see and enjoy is in fact maintained. And that has two benefits. One is for visitors, for other New Yorkers, for neighbors. It means that these streets and neighborhoods and areas are places that we all get to enjoy. This is basically public art that's preserved for everybody to be able to enjoy. But, as we've learned over the years, historic neighborhoods, historic cities, historic buildings are a tremendous source of tourism, economic development. Businesses want to be in them. People want to invest in them. People like them because they're different. They tell stories. They have character that the things that you presently are able to create just can't do in the same way. It's just the nature of the difference between the past and the present. So it's a great tool for economic development. It's a great benefit to people just in terms of giving them something that they get to partake in and enjoy for free. And it preserves history, which we all learn from.
You're discussing in terms of built environment, that is buildings and streets, mostly buildings, but I know there's also a drive to landmark interiors.
Yes, so in New York City, there's a small number of what are called interior landmarks, but it's, I think, 150 or so sites. There's something like 35,000 landmarked buildings, and only 150 are interior landmarks. By law, you can only landmark an interior space that is open to the public. So, you can never landmark the inside of somebody's home. And the one exception to the rule about open to the public is you can't landmark a house of worship on the interior because we don't want government getting in the business of saying, well, you can move that Jesus statue or you can't, or, that Star of David has to look this way. That really would be sort of problematic. But when there's something like a great theater or an auditorium, those kinds of spaces can be landmarked, although they're done fairly rarely. Well-known spaces like Radio City Music Hall, the Rainbow Room at Rockefeller Center, in our neighborhood, the great auditorium of the New School are some of the very rare interior landmarks. And they're important to have, but by their very nature, they're sort of more the exception than the rule.
Thank you. The next question is a certain amount of self-interest although I always say hello from the East Village, I am not technically in the East Village. I'm actually in the corridor between the Village and the East Village, which isn't truly landmarked. And village preservation is doing a lot of work there or trying to get it landmarked.
That's right. Yeah. So, Jonathan, where you are is in this sort of interesting confluence of where Greenwich Village meets the East Village meets Union Square. And we've been kind of referring to it as the area south of Union Square. For those who do know New York, it's basically 14th Street to 9th Street from about 5th to 3rd Avenue. And it's a part of the neighborhood that historically was more commercial, although it always had people who lived there. But it's also a part of the neighborhood that has a tremendously rich history in terms of all of the things that we talked about, but kind of on steroids. So the headquarters of the NAACP early in its existence was located here, and it's where the NAACP led its campaigns against lynching in the 1920s and against birth of a nation and against voter disenfranchisement efforts. In the 1970s, it was where the National Gay Task Force, which was the very first national gay rights organization, was located, and they led early crusades to do things like eliminate the prohibition on openly gay or lesbian people serving in the federal government, against the AIDS crisis. It's where a lot of the organizations that waged the early fights for women's rights were headquartered or were located. Also, interestingly, in the mid-20th century, it was really where what was called the New York School of Artists was pretty much headquartered, unofficially speaking. Willem de Kooning, Jackson Pollock, Franz Klein, all of those artists who really moved the center of the art world from Paris in the pre-war years to New York and America in the post-war years, they were really very much centered in this area, partly drawn to the fact that it was a lot of these old loft buildings, many of which have been converted to residence in the years since then, and in part because it was this sort of more industrial or commercial edge of the neighborhood. It never got the landmark protections that the rest of the neighborhood did. And unfortunately, what we've seen happen in the last few years is, for the first time, there's been a lot of interest in the area by developers to tear things down and replace them with big, shiny new office buildings and hotels and condos. And the sad thing is that this is a neighborhood that's undergone a tremendous amount of change over the years. And so it has these wonderfully rich layers, but the change has typically involved adaptive reuse of these buildings. So something that was once a school, something that was once a factory became a school, something that was once industrial lofts became residences, something that was a theater became a church. So, there was a continuity, and what we're seeing now is a sort of a disruption of that continuity, a destruction of it. And instead of kind of building on the great things from the past, we're really losing it. So we are waging this campaign to seek landmark protections for this area south of Union Square. And we're not there yet, but we're hoping we're going to get there.
Having attended a few of the rallies, yes. One of the interesting things in the neighborhood is an air rights transfer on the corner of St. Mark's. It's interesting in and of itself because they're trying to put this large building in a low-rise area, despite a number of tall university dormitories, but also became attached to a very strange preservation building down the block, which I wouldn't call it preservation, I'd call it Disneyfication of a building. Mm-hmm. You're getting a smirk. You know the building.
I know it well. And, as you know, we've been sort of kind of leading the charge on this. Yeah, land use regulations in New York are notoriously arcane. And there's all these different ways in which you can sort of game the system or work the system if you have the resources to do it. But basically, a developer wants to build and is building this sort of boutique tech office tower on the corner of St. Mark's Place and 3rd Avenue, which, if you know New York at all, that's what's called the gateway to the East Village, which is this neighborhood that's traditionally been kind of a sort of gritty, funky, artsy, but also sort of very vibrant area. And unfortunately, it's sort of suffering from some of this overdevelopment as well. And they want to make this office tower, which it's bad enough that they're building here, 20% larger, by purchasing air rights from a beautiful old landmarked house, which we actually got landmarked through this special provision that allows you to buy air rights from landmark structures under the premise that the profit that's going to be made for it is going to go back into the historic building to help preserve it. The reality is, in this case, the building is well preserved already. The work that they want to do is unnecessary and really would be, as you said, sort of a Disneyfication of the building. We love the fact that the building shows that it's 200 years old and has undergone some change. We don't want to see it turned into this sort of colonial Williamsburg version of what it was 200 years ago. That's not what the East Village is about. And it's not going to be open to the public. So it's not like they would be doing this for some great public purpose to, allow people to see what a house that was built in the early 19th century looks like. It's really just in order to be able to let them sell the air rights, 95% of the profit from which just goes into the pockets of the developer. So we're opposing it, and we're pretty sure we're going to win on this one. But it's just one small fight among many that we're waging at the moment.
Now, part of the supposed recovery from early disasters, 9/11, Sandy, and so on, has been a big push toward tourism, toward real estate development, toward high tech. The question really is that economic development model, given what we know about past recoveries, still going to work? And how does historic preservation impact that, or does that impact historic preservation?
Yeah. It's a good question. And, as I sort of said at the beginning of my conversation, I try not to pretend to know more than I do. But one thing that I do know is cities that preserve their historic character tend to do really, really well, because that is stuff that people want to see. They want to be around it. They want to shop in it. They want to walk around in it. They want to live in it. They want to visit it. There's ups and downs. Wall Street goes up and down. Certain types of there's bubbles. There's certain types of industries that boom and then crash. But that seems to be pretty perennial. And I'll also say, we talked about false dichotomies before. The opponents of historic preservation try to pretend that there's this sort of false dichotomy between either preservation or economic development. That could not be less true. Some of the best preserved neighborhoods in New York have undergone tremendous economic development and contributed tremendous amounts to New York City. Again, if you know these neighborhoods, Soho, Tribeca, Brooklyn Heights, what's sometimes called Ladies Mile, just to the north of our neighborhoods, around 6th Avenue, which was 25 years ago, literally a ghost town. I mean, you could see tumbleweeds going up 6th Avenue. There were all these big, old, empty buildings that had been department stores in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. Well, now it's one of the great shopping hubs of New York, again, from adaptively reusing these wonderful old buildings. So, we really can have the best of both worlds in terms of holding on to the character that makes our cities and our neighborhoods unique and distinctive, while allowing new economic development to take place. And of course, there should be new construction, even in historic neighborhoods. But I think in areas where the history is so important to what makes it attractive and appealing, preserving that history should definitely be a major part in guiding how you see the future of those neighborhoods moving forward.
Another example of this might be Soho NoHo, which is another project you're working on, where it almost seems to me that people are, killing the parts of Soho No that make it attractive for real estate development. I could be wrong.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There, just before COVID hit, there was this process going on to look at changing some of the zoning rules and other regulations for Soho and NoHo, being driven by some of the big businesses. On the downside, these neighborhoods have turned into, just a sort of, in some ways, a huge shopping mall, partly because people have violated the rules and the city has let them. So it's become a huge center of sort of like big box stores and, sort of mega shopping developments. which we don't want to see more of, and we definitely don't want to see the rules changed to make that even easier than it already is. And then beyond that, they want to change the rules to allow much bigger development in the neighborhood. And right now, the rules allow you to build buildings that can be 200, 300 or more feet tall, and there's a push to change it to allow buildings 2.5 times the size of what's there. Now, the proponents of this will say, well, you know, that area is it's so low rise and it's right in the middle of New York. We shouldn't let that be the case. The buildings do tend to be shorter than in Midtown or the financial district, but anybody who's ever walked around in Soho or NoHo knows it is wall to wall people. Those are densely packed, relatively low scale buildings with a tremendous amount of activity in them. And they want to add 40, 50, 60-story high-rises into that mix, which will not only destroy the character, but will make them unbearably crowded. And many people would argue they're already somewhat unbearably crowded as it is. So we think this is definitely the wrong direction to go in.
You mentioned big box or chain stores or international chains and things like that. This is not really a historic preservation question. I'll give you fair warning. But what do you think of things like the Small Business Job Survival Act, which is trying to keep small businesses alive and perhaps encourage new ones?
Sure. Well, you know, from our perspective, preserving small businesses is part of historic preservation and certainly part of our mission and what we're trying to do with our neighborhood. Helping to sort of protect and promote small businesses helps keep neighborhoods healthy. It also adds to the character of it. And a lot of these businesses are historic. You know, some of them have been there for 20, 30, 40, 70, 100 or more years. So we've been a big proponent of something called the Small Business Job Survival Act. Now we're working with a coalition of groups in the sort of COVID era to try to get some legislation passed on the state level that would give relief to COVID-affected small businesses as well as property owners, because the businesses can't pay the rent. So either the business is going to suffer or the property owner is going to suffer, or both. We think that some of the emergency funds for COVID should be applied towards helping to cover some of those costs. The businesses are obviously going to have to cover some of it. The small businesses are going to have, the property owners rather, are going to have to take somewhat of a hit. But we think that government should sort of step in and fill in the gap in between the two so that we don't have this ever increasing plague of empty storefronts throughout our neighborhoods, which doesn't help the property owners, doesn't help the businesses, doesn't help the neighbors. And it's not good for New York. You know, nobody wants to see streets where every storefront is empty or boarded up. We need to help keep those businesses afloat to the degree to which we can. And, you know, economically, nobody's taking it on the chin more than the small businesses from COVID.
Hi, folks. I've literally come right in the between both of you to just say such a terrific conversation. I know so many of us are learning a lot. A couple of questions that have come in that I wanted to just quickly get in here before we let Andrew also get back to his Friday night. I'm sure it's a very active Friday night in the village. Just to ask, what can we do specifically to help what you're doing? Your website has some information about getting involved. Please give us some of those ideas.
Yeah, definitely. Just go to the website, villagepreservation.org. We're a membership-based organization, so join or make a donation. But also, you know, we have a Get Involved page where you can find out about our advocacy efforts, whether it's about small businesses, landmark preservation. Send a letter to city officials urging them to take some of these steps that we've talked about, or to not do that. Volunteer your time, make a donation of your own photo collection if you're a New Yorker or you were New York, of your own historic images of the neighborhood. We'll add them to our collection. I mean, all these pictures that you're seeing here, 90% of them are ones that people donated to us. And then we get to sort of share them with the world and curate them. It's a great way of promoting interest in the neighborhood. If you're a local, you can have a friend raiser, virtual, or, you know, once it's safe to do again, in person, where you get a bunch of your friends together and introduce them to village preservation and us to them, and we talk about these mutual issues of concern. So, it's everything from money to participation to, your old pictures. They all help.
Well, that is awesome. A couple of quick questions. One is about New York versus other cities in terms of this interest in landmarks, this very activist landmark preservation mode. You can be sure Dubai has no such thing because Dubai is all about tomorrow. Talk about that. And I remember the great Ken Jackson writing an op-ed in the New York Times sort of celebrating some of these monstrosities that have come up on, Billionaires Row on 57th Street, if you remember a few years ago. And people were shocked that a historian actually said, we need buildings like that. So can you, do all of that? And I know it could be an hour-long seminar just on that. But
Sure. Yeah, I mean, New York and specifically Greenwich Village is where Jane Jacobs comes from. And so it's very much in the DNA of our neighborhoods, this sort of understanding that the small stuff is important, that buildings and neighborhoods and places have meaning to people. And it's a big part of what makes cities successful is that people feel connected to it. There's a sort of cultural imprint that it carries and that they feel invested in. And look, I will be the first to say that, we need to grow, we need to build. It's an enormously important part of New York, but we also need to preserve and protect. New York is never going to be a better Dubai than Dubai. New York is only going to be the best New York it can be. And if it stops looking and feeling and functioning like New York, it's not going to be that. And I often say to my friends in the preservation world, look, we don't want to put a sort of snow globe around the city. It's not that we can't say that we don't ever want anything to change. There does have to be change, but it should not be at the price of losing the things that add so much character, so much interest. I think it's both good for the soul, but it's good for the economy. To be frank, bottom line, people want to come to areas that have that distinct character. If we turn New York into a knockoff Shanghai, people, why would they come here? They'll just go to Shanghai. They come to New York to see New York, and so let's keep it New York.
Two questions. One, are there other cities in the world that are as obsessed with preservation as New York? Is London perhaps one of those cities?
Yeah, I mean, Europe, I would say.
Is there like a convention of all of you folks gather in these different places?
Society of Architectural Historians.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, in Europe, for instance, I think they tend to do a much better job than we do in America of preserving, especially the sort of historic center of cities. Look at the incredible amounts of tourism that these areas get because of that. There's probably no place on earth with more per capita tourism than Italy. And that's because there's so much history there. And that history is not preventing other forms of economic development. Within the United States, obviously there's, some really well-preserved cities, San Francisco, Boston, Washington, D.C. What are you pointing to?
Chicago.
Chicago has some incredible, wonderful old architecture. I'm a big Chicago.
Beautiful.
And that's a big part of those cities' success. I mean, those are cities that are doing very well. They have their challenges like all cities. New Orleans ability to bounce back has not been about, the new stuff that's been built. It's that people so love the old stuff there, the character, the spirit, the culture of the city, and they wanted to make sure that lived on. And
finally, my last question before I have Jonathan ask you his last question is, what does the pandemic mean for this role of preservation and thinking about big buildings in our lives and office spaces? Are you almost in a position where you're worried that there are going to be these big empty buildings that have already been kind of, are going to lie empty, and what will that do to the character of New York? Are you going to be in this awkward position of kind of encouraging people to move into high-rise buildings and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question in terms of what's going to happen in terms of how we use space, because we're all very much reconsidering that, especially workspaces. But, one of the great things about historic preservation is its adaptability. As I mentioned before, so many of these buildings, they used to be used for one purpose. life changed, the world changed, they were no longer well suited for those purposes, but we found new purposes for them. And that's great because you get to remain connected to that past. You don't just erase it and forget that it ever existed, but you breathe new life into it. And by the way, from an environmental point of view, that's always the best way of doing things. The greenest building is the building that's already built. So I would say, you know,
even more than because the damage to the environment, building a super wonderful green building is worse, you're saying, than keeping a regular old building.
It's never as good as just working with the building that you have already. And old buildings can be retrofitted to be as green as the newest new building. But you know, every time you destroy and build anew, you're increasing your carbon footprint, you're using natural resources. So the starting point should always be, can we reuse what's there? If we can't, you know, look at the next option. But certainly from an environmental perspective, that should always be the starting point.
Mark says Durham, North Carolina, and so many other great North Carolina cities are so much about historic preservation. And he talked about some work he did converting historical warehouse spaces into apartments and business spaces. Okay, so Jonathan, final question to you.
I would like to build first on one of Andrew's points, because I happen to live in a building that's had at least 3 lives, first as a factory building, then as an office building, now as a residential building, and it has been retrofitted to a degree to be as ecologically sound as it can be. For obvious to retrofitting, which is a perfect illustration of it. There are full 100 now in the building. My final question actually is a different sort of landmarking, because you were mentioning small businesses. Some people have discussed landmarking businesses, making the business itself a landmark. Do you think that will help landmarking? Do you think that would help in the case of a COVID recovery, or is it just generally a weird idea?
Yeah, it's definitely been talked about a lot. You know, I would say this, it's a little hard to landmark a business in the way that you can a building. You can say, all right, this building has got to stay here. You can't tear it down. It's harder to say this business can never stop existing, because at some point, the people who run the business are no longer going to be with us. They may decide that they just don't want to sort of keep going. There are some related measures that we think are pretty reasonable that should be implemented to allow businesses, when they're able to be able to stay where they are, to support them in doing that, to give either them assistance so that they can, or to give the owner of the space that they're in some sort of special consideration for allowing a historic business to stay there. So I don't think you can sort of it's a little bit apples and oranges. I don't think you can exactly translate the landmarking process into the small business preservation process in quite the same way. But that's not to say that there aren't some very concrete things that we could do in that direction that would help make it a lot easier for small businesses to be able to survive and to stay in place where they are.
Okay, well, thank you. That was a wonderful hour with Andrew Berman. Andrew was very kind to stay extra and to listen to the doctor in the beginning. And now I have a way to mark my friend Jonathan's love of hats with my first, my best hat, which is in fact a Stetson. Our friend Jonathan has great hats, and I've not worn one in 6 months, so this is just for Jonathan. And Andrew, I don't know if you're a hat guy, but you got to protect that skull when you're out in the sun, right?
I take good care of it.
All right, gentlemen. Thank you so much. I'm very grateful to Jonathan and to Andrew Berman. Please, everyone, check out villagepreservation.org and check out Jonathan on Instagram. He's at Jonathan Boorstein on Instagram. He posts wonderful pictures that people have complimented. Sorry?
Hashtag NYFlaneur.
Hashtag NYFlaneur. And tell everyone what a flaneur is.
A flaneur is a walker around the city, but it's meaningful walking. You look for interesting things.
All right, that's Jonathan. So thank you, Jonathan, also for watching 206 episodes. Andrew, what's on tap for the weekend?
A lot of work. Hopefully, getting outside of the four walls of my apartment and seeing a little bit more of the city, and checking in on a couple of actually businesses in the neighborhood and seeing how they're doing, and seeing if there's some ways in which we can help them out. We have a program going on to give them some signage about the history of their buildings to hopefully attract and bring people in. So we're working on that now.
Well, and we'd love to feature, other businesses as well as folks who are interested in this topic in future episodes. So please do let us know, Andrew. And in fact, tomorrow I have a radio show on WBAI, and I'd love to bring Andrew on that. Tomorrow we're talking to the executive director of the Greater Flushing Chamber of Commerce, John Cho. And before that, we'll be talking to Elizabeth Chu, who's talking about how schools are being reopened. And that's on WBAI, noon to 2 p.m. Eastern time on WBAI 99.5 FM and WBAI.org. Andrew and Jonathan, thank you very much. I'll say good night and good luck. And everyone, check out villagepreservation.org. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. And with that, I want to thank all of you for being here. I'm so grateful to all of you. One of the things we're going to do now is to thank our sponsors. And then we're going to do what Professor Kimberly Crenshaw, the Columbia University Law School professor who taught us when we asked, what should we do to help Black folks? She said, say their names. And so we're going to do that in just a minute. We'd like to thank our sponsors who make these shows possible, including The Inventor in You, a step-by-step guide to your first invention by Charles Cunnincarroll, developer of more than 80 patents. So please check that out at Inventor Charles and guidetoinvention.com. Also, a big thank you to our friends at Muckrack Academy, Fundamentals of Social Media, a free on-demand certification course that anyone anywhere in the world can take. Enroll today, mrac.co/social, mrac.co/social. More than 4,000 people have taken the course. Here are some examples of the certificates they've gotten and put on their websites and elsewhere, mrac.co/social. We want to tell you that we are also very grateful to our friends at She's on Call, a show that runs every Sunday from noon, from 11 a.m. to 12 Eastern. Two surgeons and friends of mine, Sujana Chandrasekhar and Marina Korean, who are high school friends at Stuyvesant, now are producing and hosting this incredible show, 11 to noon Eastern on Sundays. And then tomorrow, a reminder, we've got lots going on. We have our show with Manisha Koirala at 9 a.m. tomorrow, so 9 a.m. Eastern, meet one of Bollywood's greatest stars. And then our friend Stephen Kaplan has his Spin It Social Hour, Let's Talk Photography and Social Media show at 10 a.m. Eastern with Gary Hirshhorn, a New York City-based photojournalist, very well known at Gary Hirshhorn on Instagram, and check out Stefan's work. And then we have our WBAI show. And then on Sunday, we do the New York Times read-along with the former New York Times editorial page editor, Andrew Rosenthal. And then on Sunday night, we do our positivity with Ruth Ratlott. Please join us for all of these. If you can, please tag a friend. And we would love to hear from you. We'd love to work with you on any version of what we're doing here. And we're going to be live every day through the election at least. And how long that election will be and how it's been upended by this president and his diagnosis of coronavirus is no one can tell you. If anyone tells you they know how this is going to play out, whatever happens with the president's health, that person is wrong. I would not be surprised, for example, if the president bounces right back and benefits from somehow is able to spin this into some amazing thing for himself. He is not, he's known as the Teflon Don for a reason. And now we've seen that in so many different ways. We do want everyone to please be safe. Please put on a mask when you go out. And now we want to say their names. And so we're going to do that right now. We use this touching painting by Titus Kaffer from Time Magazine, and you see the names around the red border. And on the right is a photograph of Larcinia Floyd with her son George. She would died 2 years almost to the day before he would be killed on camera in Minneapolis, calling out her name. And with that, we are now going to say their names. Trayvon Martin, Yvette Smith, Eric Garner, Michael Brown, Laquan McDonald, Tanisha Anderson, Akai Gurley, Tamir Rice, Jerame Reed, Natasha McKenna, Eric Harris, Walter Scott, Freddie Gray, William Chapman, Sandra Bland, Darius Stewart, Samuel Dubose, Janet Wilson, Kaylin Rockmore, Alton Sterling, Philando Castile, Joseph Mann, Terrence Crutcher, Chad Robertson, Jordan Edwards, Aaron Bailey, Stefan Clark, Danny Ray Thomas, Antoine Rose, Botham Jean, Tatiana Jefferson, Michael Dean, Ahmad Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd. Those are, of course, not all the names. They're not even all the names after the killing of George Floyd. But we say those names, and I thank you all for being here and for reading those names with me. We'll be back tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Eastern with Manisha Koirala. So it's less than 12 hours from now, about 11 hours or so. 9 a.m. Eastern time. Please join us to meet a Bollywood star as we talk about her career. We talk about some big new projects that she's involved in, as well as her book about healing from cancer. And we'll learn what's happening in India as well. So please join us tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Eastern and tell your friends. Rose says love the hat, and Rose has been tweeting. Check her out, Rose Horowitz 31, one of our wonderful two producers who've been with me for 206 days. And Beatrice says, great job, Jonathan. Save New York City. And Jonathan says, thank you. Thank you, everybody. I'm so grateful to you. Please keep in touch. Two ways in which you can keep in touch and find out all the things we're up to. Number one, please go on to YouTube and please hit the subscribe button. SreeNet is my YouTube page. Just hit that subscribe button. The other is a gentle reminder via WhatsApp. All you do is hold up your phone right now and your camera. If you're an iPhone, you can just get this QR code. Otherwise, if you're an Android user, you know how to use your QR code reader. And this is not another WhatsApp group. It is just a mere gentle reminder when I am on the air. Thank you very much, everybody, and we'll see you soon. This was a very special episode, and I learned so much. Thank you, everybody.